The manifest came in at 0340 station time, while I was still at my desk working through the backlog from the Velhari resupply convoy. I almost didn't read it. 22 years of transit administration teaches you to skim, to flag, to defer the non-urgent until a civilized hour. Something in the sender code stopped me. Dominion Ecclesiastical Logistics, priority sealed, addressed not to the station's cargo office but to me personally, by name and rank. I read it twice. Then I put on my coat and walked down to cargo hold 7. The crate was 2 meters long, ventilated, and stamped in 4 languages. In the Dominion's trade tongue, the label read, Perishable Tribute, Sanctification Grade, Handle with Care, Contents, 1-1, Sarathi Juvenile, Female, Unregistered. I stood there for a moment with my breath fogging in the cold hold air. Then I found a pry bar on the equipment rack, and I opened it. She was curled in the corner of the crate on a single folded thermal blanket, knees to her chest, silver eyes open and fixed on me the way an animal's eyes fix on something that might be a threat, or might be the last thing it sees. Ash pale, small, no taller than my mid-chest, pointed ears pressed flat against her skull. The Sarathi don't speak, not the way we do. They communicate in subsonic resonance that humans feel more than hear, a vibration in the sternum. What I felt from her then was nothing. A silence so complete it was its own kind of sound. I sat down on the cold deck floor next to the crate. Is not a dignified thing for a station administrator to do at 0400. And I stayed there. I don't know how long it took. Long enough that my back ached and the hold lights had cycled through their pre-dawn dim. But eventually, the silver eyes blinked, and eventually I felt the first faint resonance. Not a word, not a meaning, just the subsonic equivalent of a question mark. Something like, "You're still here." "Yeah," I said, "I'm still here." I wrapped my coat around her shoulders and carried her to my office, and I sat her on the bunk I kept for long duty shifts, and I gave her the emergency rations from my desk drawer. Compressed grain, nothing remarkable. And I watched her eat with the focused seriousness of a child who has learned not to assume the next meal is coming. Then I pulled up the manifest again and read it for the 3rd time more carefully. The collector was due at 0900. His name was Prefect Adjudicant Sorvel, Dominion Ecclesiastical Corps, 3rd Sanctification Division. His writ of collection was countersigned by 2 Dominion magistrates and bore the ecclesiastical seal of the Order of the Glass-Eyed God, a religious institution so old and so politically entangled with the Dominion's governance structure that no frontier administrator had successfully challenged one of their writs in 60 years. The writ authorized him to collect 1 Sarathi juvenile from Varath station's holding inventory and transport her to the Sanctification Center on Dorvath Prime. I had 9 of those hours. I used them. The first transmission went to the Sarathi Diaspora Advocacy Office on Carathis Station, 40 light minutes out. Long shot. They were underfunded, perpetually ignored, and had no enforcement authority. But they kept records, and records matter. The second went to the Colonial Administration Bureau's regional office, flagged as a routine request for clarification on the legal jurisdiction of Dominion ecclesiastical writs over non-Dominion transit facilities. I had always been punctilious about jurisdictional questions. Nobody at the Bureau found this unusual. The third I sent to the duty officer of the 14th Cloflumfer Patrol, whose cutter happened to be docked for resupply. I phrased it as a scheduling inquiry. The duty officer, a young lieutenant named Karis, who had eaten at my table twice during her layover, was sharp enough to read between the lines. She came to see me in person at 0630, and we had a quiet conversation about troll schedules and documentation requirements and how long a standard writ verification review might take if conducted with appropriate thoroughness. At 0845 I put the child. I had started thinking of her as Ash, not because that was her name. The Sarathi don't use names the way we do, but because it was what she looked like, the gray pale stillness of her. In the secondary equipment locker adjacent to my office, with the rest of the emergency rations and a thermal wrap and a handlight, I showed her the interior latch. She looked at it, then looked at me, then reached up and touched my wrist, once with 2 fingers. The Sarathi equivalent, I learned later, of I understand. Sorvel arrived at 0903 with 2 armed escorts, and the absolute certainty of a man who has never been told no in a professional context. He was tall, robed in the order's gray and amber, with the glass eye pendant at his throat that marked senior ecclesiastical rank. A small sphere of clouded quartz that the order's doctrine held contained the gaze of their god, perpetually watching. He looked at me the way Dominion officials always looked at frontier administrators, with the particular patience of someone who expects to be inconvenienced briefly before getting exactly what they want. "Administrator Veth," he said, "trust the tribute unit is prepared for transfer." "Prefect adjudicant," I said, "thank you for coming in person. I've taken the liberty of initiating a standard writ verification review. Colonial administration regulations require independent confirmation of ecclesiastical collection authority in non-dominion transit jurisdictions. Shouldn't take long, a few days at most." The temperature in the room dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the hold's ventilation system. "This is a Dominion countersigned writ," Sorvel said. "It requires no additional verification." "You're quite right that it's Dominion countersigned," I said. "But Vareth Station operates under Colonial Administration Charter, not Dominion Civil Code. Creates a jurisdictional question I'm not empowered to resolve unilaterally. I've submitted the query to the regional office. In the meantime, I'm not in a position to release I looked down at my desk screen, a living minor into third-party custody without verified legal authority. Sure you understand." He understood. He simply didn't care. For 3 hours we conducted a masterpiece of bureaucratic combat. He presented precedents. I found procedural gaps. He cited Dominion ecclesiastical law. I cited colonial charter. His escorts stood by the door, with their hands near their sidearms and the look of men who were not accustomed to waiting. The verification query sat in the Bureau's inbox unanswered, because the regional office's duty administrator was a man I had covered for twice during inspection season, and I had sent him a personal note that morning asking him to take his time. Lieutenant Karras's cutter, I knew, still at dock. The patrol schedule required her departure by 1600. At 12:40, Sorvel ran out of patience. "Administrator." His voice had gone flat, pleasantness entirely gone. "I have the legal authority, the physical means, and the doctrinal mandate to collect this tribute. You have delayed this proceeding through procedural bad faith. I will note this in my report to the Dominion Prefectural Office, which will result in a formal review of your administrative charter. You will lose this posting. You may lose your certification." He paused. "You will produce the juvenile now, and we will say nothing further about your conduct today." I looked at him for a moment. "The juvenile," I said, "is not in station inventory. She arrived aboard this station mislabeled as freight, in conditions that constitute a violation of Colonial Humanitarian Transit Code, Section 7 subsection 14. Upon discovery, was legally obligated to remove her from freight status and register her as a protected minor under Colonial Administration temporary custody. She is currently in that status. Your writ authorizes collection of a tribute unit in freight inventory. There is no such unit. Cannot give you what I don't have." The silence was extraordinary. "You are," Sorvel said very quietly, "making a significant error." "I make errors sometimes," I said. "It's a hazard of the work." One of his escorts moved, not toward me, just a shift of weight, a hand settling on a sidearm in a way that was meant to be noticed. And Sorvel looked at the door to my office's secondary corridor and said, "The unit is on this station." I had spent 22 years being the man who solved problems with forms and filing deadlines and patient, careful process. I had genuinely believed, for most of those years, that process was enough. That if you built a careful enough wall of paperwork, the worst things stayed on the other side. "Prefect adjudicant," I said, and my voice came out very calm, which surprised me. "If your escort touches his weapon inside this station, I will declare a security incident under Colonial Charter Authority, which locks down this facility and requires immediate frontier patrol response. Lieutenant Karras is currently at dock with a fully crewed cutter and has been briefed on the situation. Standing orders in a declared security incident require her to detain all parties pending investigation, including parties holding Dominion ecclesiastical rank." I paused. "That review process takes approximately 3 weeks. Sorvel stared at me. "Alternatively," I said, "you can leave." The Sarathi Diaspora Advocacy Office has already received my documentation of this child's arrival status. The Colonial Administration Bureau has a pending jurisdictional query that will, eventually, produce a ruling. These things take time. Welcome to pursue your writ through proper channels. I folded my hands on the desk. I'll be here. He left at 13:08. His escorts followed. Dock logs show his transport departed Vareth Station at 13:31. I sat in my office for a while after that, in the quiet. Then, I opened the equipment lock. She looked up at me with those silver eyes, unhurried, the thermal wrap still around her shoulders. The resonance I felt from her then was something I didn't have a word for. Not relief, exactly. Steadier than relief. Something more like recognition. I never got a formal ruling from the Bureau. The jurisdictional question is, to this day, technically unresolved. Sorvel's report to the prefectural office generated a review that generated a counter-inquiry that generated a filing that is presumably still working its way through the Dominion's administrative apparatus. These things take time. Ash stayed at Vareth Station for 4 months, while the advocacy office worked her case. She helped in the cargo office. Mostly, she had a gift for inventory systems, which I suspect is a Sarathi spatial reasoning thing, and she could process a manifest faster than any of my staff. She learned to tap twice on a surface when she wanted my attention. I learned to read the resonance well enough to catch the broad meanings. The advocacy office placed her eventually with a Sarathi extended family group on Kareth Station. I walked her to the dock. She turned at the boarding gate and looked back at me, and I felt the resonance, clear and specific this time, because I'd had 4 months of practice, and because she wasn't trying to be subtle. It translated roughly as, "You were still there." I told her to go on. She did. I went back to my desk and worked through the backlog from the morning convoy, and that was the end of it, except that it wasn't. Because these things never quite end. Every few months a fresh inquiry arrives from some Dominion office or another, working through the formal channels. And every few months I send back a careful, thorough, tedious response that answers every question and resolves nothing. I have always been good at paperwork. It turns out that patience, properly applied, is a hard thing to move. The writ is still technically outstanding. I check occasionally. It sits there in the system, unresolved, waiting. I find I can live with that.